Is processing speed a real disability? Since it does not have a DSM diagnostic code, many educators do not recognize processing speed as a major issue for many students. Take a moment and think of your child. Why do you think your child has a processing speed issue? What is it in his or her daily life that makes you think that this could be a possibility? Are there difficulties with fine motor skills? Can your child cut well with scissors? Can they draw or write well with a pencil? Is there difficulty with visual skills? Do they not attend to small details and get the general gist of what they're seeing? Or do they have difficulty with word finding skills that you can tell they know what they're thinking about, but they can't get those ideas out? Or perhaps it's with following directions. You've told them what to do, but they can't do it, or they don't do it. Or perhaps it's conversations that your child has difficulty processing the information that they're being told. What you can tell from the questions that you just answered is that there are different types of processing speed that affect students. The most common type that you hear about in school and people talking about is the visual motor processing speed. And this is when a student has difficulty taking in visual information, processing, and then getting it out via their hand or body. So these students would be the ones that have difficulty drawing, writing, cutting. There's also visual processing speed issues. So this student has fine handwriting and can cut well, but it takes them longer than the typical child to take in visual information. And so it takes them longer to do things like read or look at a picture and understand what's happening there. And then the least understood one is verbal processing speed. This is when your child takes longer to process verbal information, put it together, and then make a reply. So these are the students that have difficulty answering questions on the spot or quickly processing instructions. And then the last one is cognitive processing speed. And these are the ones that their visual and verbal skills are fine and motor skills, but they have more difficulty in taking disparate pieces and putting them together to make sense out of it. So cognitively, they're working with information longer to come up to a conclusion. So within these types of processing speed we talked about, I mentioned some things that had to do with input of information. When we're designing an intervention for a student, we always try to look at to be very specific to what the area of deficit is so that we can identify an intervention directly to that. So we've talked about visual, verbal, motor, cognitive, and now we're going to talk about whether those types of processing speed issues have to do with the input of information. And as you look at it, visual is very much an input process. You have to look at the information and take it in before you can process it. Motor is an output, so that would not be on the input side. Verbal is very much an input issue that you have to take in that language before you can process it. Then once it is the information is in, whether that's verbal or visual, you need to process and work with that information. So this would be the cognitive part of the processing speed. So how long does it take your child to process the information once they have it? Would be the processing part, and that can be no matter what modality we're talking about. And then there's the output. So this would be the verbal output if they're talking, the motor output if they're writing, the movement output if they're doing motor skills. So in looking at this, we're first taking down what modality is it: visual, motor, visual, motor, verbal, cognitive, and then we're taking those, and a cross section. Is this an input skill, a processing skill, or an output skill? So let's talk a minute about input. With input, you're looking at helping visual. If they need help with visual input, we're going to recommend vision therapy, where they build the visual muscle and the visual attention skills that they need to more quickly take in visual information. If it's motor, we'd recommend occupational therapy, where they can build their motor skills so that they can pick up things quickly, hold a pencil better, all of those things that would go with the motor input. For speech, if the language is weak, we would recommend speech and language therapy so that they are comprehending, they have their strong auditory processing skills, they can hear the sounds, they have all the discrimination skills and attention skills needed for processing language. And then there's educational remediation, which works on having students sort of globally use all of the skills of their visual and verbal input. Now we turn to the processing, which is where all the work is being done in the brain. The major part of processing happens in the working memory. So the stronger a student's working memory is, the better they're going to be able to process information. This is why we want to get all those rote skills of decoding, visual perception, auditory perception as strong as they can be, so that their compensation for their input weaknesses is not pulling on their working memory skills and taking away from their ability to process that information. Also, a huge factor in processing is executive functioning skills. The executive functioning is often called the CEO of the brain. It's your executive secretary. It's where you say, I have an appointment on Tuesday and I need to be there at 3 o'clock, so therefore I need to leave the house at 2:30 because the traffic's bad that day, and I need to bring along my insurance card and this and that and the other thing. So that's the way we as adults would be using our executive functioning. For students, it's that I have a homework assignment and I have to do these pages, and it's in my math book and it's going to take me forever to do, and therefore I'm going to hate doing it. So with executive functioning, they would be able to say, I have my math homework, I have 3 pages, it's going to take me about 10 minutes. I'm going to read the directions. I'm going to start with problem 1. I'm going to remember to look at the sign if it's a math program. I'm going to remember to spell my words correctly if it's a writing program. But in any ways, the executive functioning skills allow the student to take a big task, break it down into steps, and do one step at a time. In doing that, it helps them continue processing the information. It's giving smaller chunks of information to process, and therefore making that processing move more smoothly from one step to the next. And then finally, we have the output. This would be the speech if they're answering a question. It would be the writing if they're writing an essay. It would be the actual going and moving and getting the item they're supposed to get if it's motor. So with output, if it's a motor issue, it's still occupational therapy. Occupational therapy is going to help the input, the processing, and the output. Speech and language therapy is also going to help the input, the processing, and the output. And as is educational therapy or educational remediation, because what we're looking at, the goal of it all is the output. It's generally when you look at your child and you identify an area of weakness, you're identifying because of the output. You're seeing them being a slow writer. You're seeing them being slow at answering the question. But to get to the output, we have to have the input and the processing strong prior to output. So those are all remedial things that you can do to help build the skills that are causing the child to be slow at processing information. There are also accommodations that can be made within the classroom. The most common one is extra time. This can be extra time on tests. It can be extra time on assignments. It can also be extending the deadline so that everybody else is due on Tuesday, but you know you need a weekend because of how much time it takes, so your child's is due on Monday. The other option that I'm really liking a lot better for these child, instead of giving them 2.5 more times work, is cut down the work so that they can do it in a more reasonable amount of time equal to what their peers are spending. So analyzing the workload for the real content that needs to be done and cutting off as much as can be as possible without losing knowledge so that they can be done more quickly. Extended deadlines I just talked about, so that you have a weekend to do it in rather than trying to just shove an hour and a half worth of work in a nighttime where everybody else is taking 30 minutes. Large print is very helpful for students that have visual input issues. And then for students with motor issues, the use of a computer and or a calculator can really help. I do recommend that until 3rd grade, students still work on their motor skills. Prior to 3rd grade, beginning to use the computer can be very helpful. And by middle school, being a fluid typist and using a calculator fluently can really help save time, and there are accommodations at school such that they should be able to do that if they have a diagnosed processing speed issue. I also really like speech to text and text to speech software. So speech to text allows the child to dictate. I do recommend that they first outline and know what they're going to talk about before they do their speech, and that would be the executive functioning part. And then text to speech, there are now programs that can quickly scan PDFs, can scan books, and then read them to you. They allow you to highlight and bookmark. You can do the speed at which the text is read to you. But for kids with visual input issues, this can be very helpful because the visual input can really affect reading fluency. So it takes a long time to read, but they have no trouble with comprehension. So having the audio books, or if the books aren't on audio, doing the scanning and text-to-speech software is hugely helpful in saving time. So in summary, what we're talking about with the processing speed issue is to identify the specific area of processing speed that's a deficit. Then provide the most targeted intervention for those areas of deficit so that we can speed up the processing in both the input, processing, and output component for the child. And then finally set up accommodations in the classroom and with the teacher so that they are not at a disadvantage compared to their peers. Thank you very much. Feel free to contact us at the K&M Center, knmcenter.com, if you have any more questions about processing speed. Thank you.